Good evening, everybody. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is the nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books, and Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We are delighted to be joined tonight with all of you to celebrate The Breaks, which is Julietta Singh's brand new book, and to be joined in conversation with Emily Bernard. Emily is the author of Black is the Body, Stories from My Mother's Time and Mine, from my grandmother's time and mine, which was named one of the best books of 2019 in Kirkus Reviews and National Public Radio. Black is the Body won the 2020 Los Angeles Times Christopher Isherwood Prize for autobiographical prose. Emily's previous books include Remember Me to Harlem, The Letters of Langston Hughes and Carl Van Vechten, which she edited, a New York Times Notable Book of the Year, and Some of My Best Friends, Writings on Interracial Friendship, which was chosen by the New York Public Library as Notable Book of the Year. That is a book that I was just saying, has been super important to many people at Charis for many, many years. So it came out, I think, in 2005, is that right?
I think something like that.
And it has been one of the tools that we have used in our anti-racist workshops and groups for many, many years. So we are really excited to have Emily with us. She has also worked on many other books, including Michelle Obama, the First Lady, in Photographs, and so much more. So we're thrilled to have you here, and we're thrilled to have you be here in conversation with Julietta Singh, who is a writer and academic whose work engages the enduring effects of colonization, the current ecological crisis, and queer feminist futures. She is the author of two previous books, No Archive Will Restore You, which came out in 2018, and Unthinking Mastery, Dehumanism and Decolonial Entanglements from Duke University Press, also in 2018. She currently lives in Richmond, Virginia with her family, and The Breaks is just out. So we're thrilled to get to be an early celebrator of this wonderful and exciting book. I want to encourage folks, wherever you're watching from, if you have questions, we'd love for you to put your questions in the Ask a Question box, which is at the bottom center of the screen. If you are on your phone and you can't access that box for whatever reason, feel free to put it in the chat and I will move it over to that place. We also just love it if you shout out, what your relationship is to these two authors. If you've read some of their work already, we love to know that. You can also let us know where you're watching from, what brings you here tonight. If you're a family friend, all those things. We love for it to feel as warm as possible in the chat. So let us know how you're doing tonight. And I am going to get out of the way and let y'all get right into it because we're really excited to hear more about The Breaks.
Thank you, ER.
Should we start with some thanks?
Yes, definitely.
So
Let's do that.
Tanya, when you are, we need to thank our agent, Tanya, who Emily and I share together, and Carol Taylor as well from McKinnon Literary Agency. I just heard as well from ER that his coworker, Dartricia, was instrumental in making this happen. So I wanted to give a shout out to her too. And then everyone at Coffee House Press. My editor, Lizzie Davis, who's amazing and having some connection problems right now, but desperately trying to get in because she loves a love fest and understands this to be a love fest. And then Marit and Daly and Courtney and our new awesome Black feminist CHP leader, Anitra Budd, who I'm so excited to be working with. Those are all mine.
Fantastic. How's my sound, by the way?
I think your sound is good.
Okay, I'm hearing a bit of an echo.
Okay,
so
I think we're not
a problem. I'm sorry, did you say you can hear an echo? Okay, you can't.
Emily, right. You may want to just want to check and make sure you don't have any other tabs open because we don't hear an echo, but it may.
Oh, you don't? Okay.
But that may be causing an echo on your end.
ER, you're like the voice of God right now.
That's right. Just popping in to let you know.
I like that.
All right, you guys indulge me while I close all these tabs.
No problem. Take your time. It's like a light show.
Okay. Okay. I think it's working. So, Julietta, we have some friends in the room, and I want to say we have a friend in Christina Sharp who's here. Christina, yes. She says congratulations to you.
Thank you. Hi,
Natalie Diaz says congratulations. Yes. So many people. You'll see at the end.
Okay.
All the people coming in to congratulate you on this enormous achievement. So let me begin, because this book just knocked me out, as you know. It is erotic and cerebral, modern and old-fashioned, rational and romantic. It's fluid. It operates on the head and the heart and somewhere deeper. I mean, I felt you breathing from deep within, and I really felt so connected to the voice throughout this book. I mean, I talked to you about it being really an experience. It felt hypnotic to me. You know, I would look up and think, am I dreaming this? Partly because I was so thrilled to find a companion, you know, in this mystery of life, in your voice and your stories. It is truly breathtaking, is a word that keeps coming to mind. Can we start by just talking about the genesis of the book? When was it born? How was it born?
Yeah, it's a great start. So let me first say, we really did begin. We met yesterday, and we began by zooming in with each other and really starting with, I love you, because
Yes.
I was in the middle of reading Black is the Body, and you were in the middle of the breaks, and neither of us had quite finished yet, but we were really speaking to each other in a kind of magical way. And I said to you yesterday that I really am so enthralled by Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God, and I was thinking about her while I was reading you, and then she started popping up in your book, and then your book ended with this beautiful reference to the idea of hungry listening, and I kept thinking about the two of us as hungry reading.
I love that.
Over the last 24, 48 hours of being in each other's work. So thank you. What an honor to be in conversation with you. I couldn't imagine a more magnificent person to be in conversation with for the start of the life of the breaks. And its origin story. You know, I think there's always many origin stories. And I was thinking about this because I think one of the ways the book began is kind of exactly where it begins, which is a real anxiety I was experiencing when my daughter started her formal K-12 public education, and realizing so quickly into her education that she was learning stories that I radically disagreed with. And in some ways, of course, it wasn't surprising because it was a top-down education that's telling her official state histories that are not our histories, not the histories that we teach, not the histories that we tell, and not the histories that we believe. And so it started in a sense because I needed to start thinking right away about how to challenge those narratives. But also I write somewhere in the book that it started, you know, one day I was changing her diapers and thinking about Barack Obama, and thinking about this deep desire I had to write a letter to the Obamas as parents, and to think about, you know, the promise of their reign and the hope that it ushered in, and how crushing a certain moment in 2012, 2013 felt around the bombing of innocent people in other parts of the world and the exclusion of people into this country who urgently needed refuge and help, and so I think there were a lot of letters churning, and I also include a little kind of radical letter from my own mom in the book. So letters have been really important to me, and so this one really started as a desire to write to my child the things that I felt and think and wanted to give to her in the same way that I had been given magical maternal letters of my own.
It's such an intimate experience. She moves through the book, your daughter. You really feel the deep communication between the two of you. I felt that tremendous pleasure of overhearing this conversation. I wonder if you considered other forms, or was this a form? Is this a vehicle the book needed? That these stories needed this particular vehicle in the second person? Was there never another choice?
Yeah, there wasn't a choice for me, but there was a moment where I was in conversation with our agent, and she was like, I feel like the epistolary form is really being used right now, and maybe it might be better if we tried something else. And I tried something else, and she read it, and she was like, we've made a terrible mistake. and I felt great relief, because it was a letter, and I wrote it very much in the spirit of a letter, which is to say, I didn't imagine necessarily publishing it. And I felt that the topic and the conversation felt very much outside of the mainstream. And in that sense, I didn't have confidence or faith that it would have a home in the publishing world. And so for me, I think the letter was the most organic way of writing it, because it's what it was. It's what I wanted it and meant it to be. And I wrote, many times over, I'd have these agonizing moments over dinner where I'd be telling my family, like, I feel like I'm writing something that is not digestible to the broader world. And the thing that I kept telling myself was, but it's digestible for my child, and that's really the aim of it. So
that's another thing that word organic, that exactly describes the way the book feels. It's true that there are other writers who've been using the second person as a kind of device, but it's another way. This book somehow, it's so polished. I don't see the seams at all, even though gaps are important to the book.
Yeah.
And it's quite intimate. There's an urgency to it. One of the questions that I wanted to ask about the books that have come before, is this book a departure from the kind of larger journey you're on as a writer, as an intellectual, or was this an organic, kind of a turn for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I don't know what your experience is, Emily, but every book I write opens the window to the next book that I write. And I think for many writers, that's the case, usually it's something that goes unanswered, or something that I haven't taken seriously enough in a work that came before, and then I'm kind of primed to do it. And so it's different insofar as it's an address to my child, that in some ways is probably the most urgent thing that I've ever written. I think I felt it more urgently. But I also think that across all of my work, one very academic book, one much more experimental, the sort of weird feminist experimental body memoir, and now this, which reads as a more or less straightforward epistolary form, that maybe not straightforward. You can challenge me on that, because you're right that there are a lot of breaks and there are a lot of maybe unconventional moves in there. But I think at the core of all of those books, I'm really trying to think about the question of what it means to be human in this particular political moment, the relationship between that sense of the human that we've inherited through colonization and neo-colonial forces that continue to very much govern our most intimate lives, and the question of what other models for being human might exist in stories and histories and everyday practices. And so I think this book in some ways was really me pushing myself to try to think not just intellectually, but emotionally about how we might live very differently as human beings.
Can you talk to us about the title, The Breaks?
Yeah, I kind of want you to talk about the title. So I think The Breaks has many resonances here. One is it was called The Breaks. Interestingly, I think it was called The Breaks even before my body entered in. So one of the threads of The Breaks is a body that's breaking down and undergoing surgeries while I'm writing. But it was meant to be a book that had nothing to do with the body. And so I had started writing it, and then I had to stop because of a physical crisis. But I was really thinking about The Breaks, its core. If a letter can have an argument, if a letter can have a thesis, the argument of the book is that we have inherited a kind of model of parenting, a very modern model of parenting that is really about a reproduction of ourselves as the same. So we have kids in order to bestow upon them our best values and our best ideas and our best practices, and that at this particular moment in history where we've come beyond the point of a kind of anticipation of climate catastrophe, but are deep in it, and where our everyday lives are so entirely sutured to practices of extractive capitalism and deeply interwoven with systemic racism, that we need to think about a different kind of production that's not about reproduction, but that's about making people who are quite unlike us. And so for me, the challenge of the book was really to think about how to parent, not by bestowing my best lessons, but by fundamentally challenging my best lessons with and through my child.
Mm-hmm.
So,
I felt that.
There's a lot of breaking with in the book. What kinds of things can we break with, and what would it mean to break with our conventions, but not break from each other, break with each other in an effort to create ourselves differently and establish ourselves differently.
There's that moment, it's almost like a prayer. Break with me, break with me, break with me. It's a wish for you and your daughter. I thought about the breaks in relation to storytelling and how this book is disrupting old false narratives, even in its structure. The way that you continue to give us places to breathe, or pauses in your own thinking. I felt the deep consideration. I mean, this book is packed with these densely imagined scenes throughout the book. And these moments when we have to stop and really wonder and try to understand what's happening. And then often you come back to revisit things you've done or said. The pauses are essential in the telling of the story. And the lie, of course, in conventional history is that it's seamless. So it seems to me that's what the book is doing. It's showing us the scenes,
yeah,
and forcing us to acknowledge them. But also maybe as a parent, as you said, going against a very traditional way of thinking of parenting, that our kids are just repositories for our own histories.
Mm-hmm.
There's a way in which you, as a mother, as a writer, are always stopping to consider that and trying to work against that.
Mm-hmm.
Is that close to what?
Yeah, I think that's beautiful. I mean, I think you're seeing inform something more nuanced and exciting than maybe I understood. But I think that's what's beautiful about having hungry readers, right? That you're picking up what I'm throwing down, even when I don't totally know what I'm throwing down. But I think for me, those breathers were also moments. The book was a puzzle for me to put together. Some of it clicked in, I knew in my mind, okay, I'm doing this here, and so this has to come after. But some of it was very hard to piece together. And I agonized. I'm like, I love revision. I'm one of those. I always joke and say I'm a revision pervert because I get incredible amounts of pleasure out of having something there already that I get to craft and move around and maneuver. But I think those spaces for me, the literal places in the book where I'm pausing, where there's bigger breathers and smaller breathers, were really essential to the understanding that to a suture that is also a break, right? Okay, we're still connected. It's still one long letter, but we need to take a pause here, and we're moving on to something else. And I think it has something to do with the question of adjacency that the book is invested in. The line that you like, together apart together, and thinking about. So there's something formal going on that's echoing the desire of the book, or the life that's being described in the book, which is an unconventional form of communal living.
Yes, I want to talk about that, if you don't mind. Apart together apart. As you know, I was texting with friends earlier and just sharing all these stories, all your wisdom. Really, I feel like you're renaming a lot of experiences in this book. Friends in love. Can you talk to us about living adjacent parenting and having a relationship a core relationship that's based as much in being distinct as it is in having this union.
Yeah, yeah. So I first of all, I have to say I love that Nathan, who is my co-parent and best friend, is emerging through the early reception of this book as like a kind of star. It makes me very happy. But I write a lot about the kind of movement that Nathan and I have gone through over the last 15 or so years of becoming best friends that were very intellectually engaged with one another, very intimate and close in our friendship, and then kind of morphing into something that looked like a heterosexual relationship, but at its core was always very different from that. And then having to kind of like maneuver our way through a form of being together for which we had no models. And I think we were talking about that too with your daughter, kind of questioning what the institution of marriage means and how we can think about different ways of being together. And for Nathan and I, a really important part of that journey was understanding fundamentally who we were, and instead of seeing those differences as opportunities for breaking, we use them as opportunities for living in different ways together, for staying allied, and for continuing a kind of deep and abiding friendship that is more family than anything I've ever known, more deeply filial than anything I've ever known and anything that I've ever had. So we call each other queer co-parents, and we live in a duplex. A lot of it's about architecture. There's a lot of like meditations on queer architecture and living together and what feels like a kind of holistic family frame, but also gives us the opportunity to separate off and live our independent lives. And I don't know if that's totally answering your question or if you have.
No, absolutely. I'm interested in the book. What's happening in the book is a lot of invention. There's a dedication to living creatively. And I love also the term middle cutie that your daughter coins. I mean,
Yeah.
thinking about new ways of naming our experience.
Yeah, to describe trans folks, it was her like 3 or 4-year-olds. Oh, middle cuties. Yeah.
It's fantastic. I just see your house as a place where there's lots of language and so much possibility. But then in the book, something that's very important with these ancestral figures, your mother, your father, playing very different but equally devastating roles in your life. They themselves are carrying devastating stories. Mm-hmm. So the question of inheritance and the question of invention. Mm-hmm. Your book is taking up this question, which I just can't get enough of. Are we in fact the authors of our own experiences? Can we invent something new? I love the deep belief in this book that it's possible. That's why I think I left feeling so refreshed. Even in the middle of all this ruin around us, I left with the sense that there are still possibilities. We can still invent things in our small societies. But what about these larger histories? You had to contend with them. You had to find a way to tell these stories that had devastated your ancestors to live, stories your father had never talked about. Too huge, too unspeakable. You speak them in here. Can you talk about the challenges of telling these stories in your book and what it costs?
That's there are so many things I can say in response to that question. I think my parents are, my father passed away in 2013. My mom is probably on the Zoom right now feeling really proud of her youngest kid. And my mom is often, in fact, my mom and my dad, but my mom is often a figure in my writing. And I think that that's a hard position to occupy, to have a writer daughter who uses you to think through political and ethical and intellectual and emotional questions. And she does it very gracefully. Thanks, Mom. But I think, for me, I think looking to our parents, your question was kind of toggling around inheritance and invention. And I think we have to really deeply understand our inheritances in order to invent other ways of being, or to carry over, to cull and glean from what happened before us into a future that we desire, and a future that we can survive. And I think for my parents, my mom is a product of a Holocaust surviving mother, my grandmother, and my father was a young boy during the extraordinarily violent upheaval that was the partition of India in 1947. And I thought a lot about those histories. I've had to learn a lot about those histories. And I think, from them, a lot of those histories are buried. A lot of them are not spoken of. Some of them my mom doesn't even know because it's one generation beyond her, but certainly affected her relationship with her mom as it has affected my relationship with her, and certainly will trickle down to my relationship with my daughter. And so I use my parents often, not because I think our stories are exceptional, but because I think our families and our parents and our legacies are vital places from which to understand where we are now, and to puzzle together where we might go. And so I look to my mom my mom's also an incredible environmental and political activist in central Canada, where I grew up, and really reared me with a kind of fierce ecological and socio-political education around Indigenous rights, or lack thereof, in Manitoba and the province where I grew up, and the history of colonization in Canada, and the intimate relationship between those histories of human exploitation and ecological devastation. That was very much the kind of maternal language of my youth, and continues to be now. And so she's an incredible site for me, an incredible resource as I think about parenting, but also I have a complex relationship with her, and I have across time. And there have been times where, echoing the title of the book, where our relationship has been under great strain, and we have broken, and having to really abide by those breaks and live with them in ways that have felt at times unlivable. So I think, for my parents, and, the question of my father and the things that he didn't speak of, I think my mom's much more willing and able to kind of dialogue about the possibilities of the past and the possibilities of the future. And I think for my father, he experienced forms of early childhood trauma through the partition of India that were, as you're saying, unspeakable. And I think that's the beauty of a once removed lineage, where we get to speak some stories that were not possible for our the generations who came before us to articulate, and that's really been for me. I went to grad school to study South Asian history and politics. I went to learn my parents' history. I'm sure you can say the same thing about your own education, like a pursuit of knowledge that's very much about a political understanding that's also a deeply personal one, and then trying to figure out what to do with that.
I was just here thinking, are our children entitled to all of our stories? Oh, and by the way, I want to say, definitely, I want to shout out to your amazing mother, because she's such a compelling figure in this book.
She always feels like a villain, and I always tell her she's like a little hero.
Not at all. And also, thank you to your mother and every mother that lets us write about them. I mean, it's a gift, right?
Yes.
To have a loved one tolerate that, the thing, our need to figure things out on the page. But I want to know about you as a mother, and how motherhood affects your writing, affects your intellectual life, and vice versa. Talk to us about that.
I mean, I think, the question of urgency is certainly amplified by being a parent. Your book, which I finished reading this morning, ends with an incredible James Baldwin quote where he says, "I can't afford despair. You can't tell the children there is no hope." And I love that. I can't afford despair. And I think that becoming a mom even though it was never my desire. I didn't have any kind of profound desire to become a parent. I entertained it, I thought about it, and then suddenly I was one. And I think that, there's a lot of intimacy between motherhood and writing. Both for me are incredibly bodily, both for me are incredibly physically and psychologically challenging. Both for me are puzzles that I'm always trying to muddle through. And there are very practical ways of answering that question. Like, what did it mean to be a writer before, and what does it mean to be a writer now? Your relationship to time changes. How quickly you can accomplish things that used to take you a very long time changes. But I think they're so intertwined, in fact, and it hasn't historically been a popular thing to say, but they're so intertwined that, my daughter in one way or another, in more and less significant ways, makes it into every book I've written, even my academic book. She appears, that there's a way in which to rethink the question of forms of human living. I can't ask that question without thinking about her, without asking over her too. I don't know if that resonates with you. How would you answer that question for yourself, since you write so much about your daughters and the experience of parenting?
Well, you and I talked on the phone about, it gets more complicated, of course, like everything else, as time goes by.
Yeah, you said to me early on in our conversation yesterday, I really would like to talk to you in a few years when your daughter's older. Like, I will reach out to you 100%.
Absolutely. We need to kind of help guide each other, because I certainly discover boundaries by stepping over them. And then the girls remind me, that is my life.
Yes.
And also that inclination to embellish, which I can't help.
Yeah.
They can understandably, get tired of that. And right. And they have a private life now in a different way than they did when they were really, really small.
Yeah.
So yeah, we'll talk about that as I'm entering into the forest of the next project, and we'll have to figure out the boundaries together, what they are. But like you, I'm hungry to know about my parents, the worlds they lived in, particularly my mother, and all the choices that she had to make, all the compromises. My mother is no longer on the earth. So many questions I wish I'd asked her. And I wonder about the questions my daughters will ask me, reading the work and then watching me live my life, and the dynamic between these things, who we are on the page and who we are in real life.
Yeah. This reminds me, one of the things that I wanted to say in your question about my parents and my mom is that one of the ways that my mom is very useful to me in thinking about parenting is that I can look at her, I can analyze her, and I can analyze our relationship in a way that I'm incapable of doing from the other direction. As a mom, it feels at this point almost impossible for me to really analyze like what I'm doing and what my role is and how and with her, I have a kind of a much longer time, 40 some odd years of like being in that relationship and really thinking about it. But I also think those stories, there's this beautiful Antonio Gramsci quote that I always like to think with, where Gramsci says the starting point of critical elaboration is knowing thyself as an infinite repository of history, and that it's our ethical obligation to understand the kind of archive, to assemble the archive of those traces that have been left in us across time and through our family histories, through our political histories. And for me, those kind of like maternal, paternal, genealogical stories are stories that are so vital, not just to us as individuals, but for a future, for another kind of future. So for me, I think there's nothing particularly exceptional. I mean, maybe there's many things exceptional for all of us, but it's the mundaneness, it's the experience of so many something like the Holocaust or something like the partition or something like colonization is an experience so intimate and so shared, and because they're the closest things to me and the things that have most immediately made me, it's there that I go. But, there's a moment in the breaks where I'm writing to my daughter and saying, you're going to have to draw from our histories, but you're also going to have to draw respectfully from the histories of others who have had no less a hand in making you. To think about us in this conversation, the history of slavery is not my history, but it's a history that I can never think without. I think we need to understand ourselves intimately and then continuously widen the frame in order to move towards something different.
Absolutely. I'm feeling right now, I want people to hear a little bit of your book. How do you feel about reading just for a few pages before we open it up? And people who have questions, are going to invite you into the table in a moment, but let's hear your words and your beautiful voice.
We were thinking about the Nathan part, so I'll go there.
Please.
On queer kinship. We coined the term friends in love to describe our relation while smoking pot and sipping juice at my old Formica table. I had just returned from a trip to the Bay Area where a would-be fling in wine country had gone woefully awry. Having nowhere else to go, I crashed in Berkeley with friends, a queer couple with a penchant for rescue. We spent the evening before I flew home evaluating my flailing romantic life. My friends invited me to write a list of 5 characteristics I could not do without in a future partner, which I scrawled on a piece of scrap paper that remains to this day in the drawer of my bedside table. I was embarrassed by performing this task, which seemed both a practical undertaking aimed at offering me personal clarity and a witchy conjuring to manifest my ideal person. The next day, fresh off my flight, as I lumbered down Franklin Avenue on the number 2 bus, I passed Nathan's street and felt an overwhelming sense of arrival. I considered the feeling for days, wondering over a bonded connection that was neither conventionally romantic nor simply amicable. A week later at the Formica table, giddy and stoned, I gathered the courage to present Nathan with my friends in love formulation. He smiled elatedly, accepting wholeheartedly what was, in retrospect, a queer proposal. We were intimate accomplices, misfits bunking collectively in my minuscule apartment. We studied together, learning in constant communion. Nathan seemed to live on my old orange sofa, flat on his back with a novel or book of philosophy in hand, while my once feral cat, Cassie, slept on his belly. He couldn't move for anything if she was content, even though she made a practice of attacking him in unanticipated intervals to ensure he knew his place among us, a newcomer, a man. He was and remains the gentlest person I have ever known, and the first relationship of any kind in my life, whether filial, friendly, or romantic, that grew through a total lack of judgment or possessive feeling. Nothing about me deterred him or made him bristle. He approached me as he did his most coveted works of literature, with meticulous care and textual precision, with repetition, reading me over and over again with a lasting patience, interpreting my gaps and fissures not as failures but as opportunities for sense-making. It is harder from this vantage point to say what he has gained through our queer solidarity, but I know he finds in me an unflappable kinship we never knew we could desire for ourselves. Amid our leap into late onset adulthood, we felt the hailing of normativity, the strong sense that we should make our relationship legible for the world. We merged into a couple form, following a straight path because we didn't yet have the drive to blaze another trail. When I finished my PhD and got an assistant professor job in Virginia, we packed up our graduate student lives and headed southeast in a beat-up old Honda Civic. We lived out our heterosexual union, happily nesting for the long haul, living a deeply affectionate, though largely non-sexual life. More often than not, we treated sexuality with humor. Nathan teased me about my unabashed attraction to butches, a fact I had always thought was an imperceptible desire. In turn, I joked that in our awkward sex, Nathan seemed to be keeping full-throttled anxiety attacks at bay, suffering his way through an act he would have much preferred to avoid. I referred to Nathan as monastic, which I still think best describes his style of being. This was years before asexual found its way into a public vocabulary, so he had little language for someone who simply preferred not to engage in sexual contact with others. His library and his collection of records have always been his love objects of choice, so much so that he has written evocatively about the sensuality of those particular relations. I was still at a remove from using queer to describe myself, not because I had any hesitation about queer sexualities, but because I was uneasy about laying claim to pre-existing identity categories. In the couple form, we would lapse from time to time into a pathological approach to our sex life, feeding a mutual worry that our scant and uneasy sexual contact constituted a lack between us. At a critical juncture of our relationship, we descended into a corrective frenzy and sought medical advice for Nathan's muted sex drive. He underwent testing that concluded he had abnormally low levels of testosterone and was prescribed injections to restore him into the proper fold of normative masculinity. Nathan was unfaltering in response to the medical prescription, unequivocally declaring, "I am who I am, and I hold the politics I hold precisely because I fall beyond the capture of normativity." He refused to be delivered into corrective masculinity or to aspire anymore to an other-oriented sexual drive. It was such a simple act to commit without pause to accepting himself exactly as he was. I felt astonished by the gesture, so mundane as to be spectacular. Rather than to break from each other at this crucial point, we broke instead from traditional ideas about what constitutes love and family. I followed Nathan's commitment to simple gestures, allowing us to live our lives exactly as we were, and in so doing to change the entire feel of it. Disengaging from a sexual fantasy of lasting love, we offered each other instead an enduring home, the safest place to falter and thrive, a place as psychic as it is spatial, in which to break and to heal, to come apart when we must, then to mend into new alignments. We became what we already were, friends who make family together, who raise a wild little human and offer sanctuary to stray animals, who collaborate intellectually, who make meals together and bandage each other's wounds. Friends who, in breaking from convention, have become unbreakable.
That's beautiful, Julietta. I mean, really, I told you, I had a season this summer of just going to wedding after wedding, and I just fell into these paragraphs about your relationship, which are really some of those delicious descriptions of a love relationship that I've read. I mean, it's a testament to the creativity in your home, in your heart, the way you look in a focused, kind of head-on way at love, at erotic connection, and the connection between those states of feeling, and also the space you live in. It's absolutely refreshing. I felt refreshed reading it, and interested to look at my relationship with a new vocabulary. Really,
yeah.
That's what you do.
John's in for some changes.
We have some new terms now
Totally
to describe what's happening.
Yeah, but we were talking
really
about
beautiful.
that too, Emily. How important it is to have models, for other ways of being and dwelling and making home and making space and making family, and queer communities have learned this message time and time again. But I think there's something so a friend of ours joked once that we're queerer than queer because we've like exceeded a sexual relationship altogether and are just really making family and a form of family that I think is so different from the forms that both Nathan and I had. And I think that kind of invention that you're signaling so, would have been so important to me, and I hope is so important to others who are searching for other ways of being in intimate relation that isn't so prescribed.
Mm-hmm. I hear you. Let me ask you, what is writing to you?
What is writing to me? I have this very uneasy experience of hearing other writers talk about writing and reading, because often writers will say, like, I started reading at 3. I was a voracious reader. I was like always with my head in the books, and I wrote my first short story when I was 5. Like, you hear these kind of like narratives of like very early self-becoming. And I was a person who was desperately afraid of reading, and definitely not confident enough to write. And I used to carry around a novel or another all the time with me when I was young, and I would never read it. But all through junior high and all through high school, I was a dropout. I was getting kicked out all the time. But I'd always have a book with me, and I'd always have a little journal. And I had such a, and when I was little, I used to go to the public library at the top of my street, and I'd check out like a pile of books, and I'd bring them home, and I'd put them beside my bed, and I would be daunted by them, and I would never read them, and then I would return them. And I liked being in the space of the library. I liked the feeling of the library. I liked the smell of the library, but I was very deeply afraid of not understanding. And I think for me, becoming a writer has really meant, and becoming a reader, and hilariously becoming a literature professor, because who the hell is scared of reading and writing all their lives and then basically like lives completely into their fear. But I think for me, writing and reading have been acts of really understanding that intimacy isn't about all knowing, and that one can read a novel, or one can read philosophy, or one can read anything and understand a thread and live through that thread and abide by that thread. And that I really had to abandon the fantasy of kind of mastering the whole or getting the whole, and to just find what was there. And so I think for me, writing is always a question. I'm always in pursuit of something that I can't figure out, and writing doesn't figure it out, but writing helps me in the asking. I think of writing as asking, and I think of reading and the intimacy. I mean, I think it's why it's so incredible to find you, because it's like I can just be with you, and being with you in some sense is so mooring. Like I am with you, and I understand, and we're not the same, but I really get what you're throwing down, And so I think it took me a long time to discover writing like that, writing where I could find myself, writing where I could be with you as a writer and understand where you were going. So it's a long-winded answer, but the answer is really, like, for me, writing is about asking questions and learning what I care about, and figuring out how to transform myself.
I have so much to say in response. I'm going to try to, first of all, I feel reading your book and coming to know you, Zora Neale Hurston talks about having these dreams, and they represent different stations of her life. Mm-hmm. And she, at some point in her life, imagined meeting these women who would offer her comfort. I feel I've arrived somewhere after reading your book and talking to you. I said to my husband, I read Julietta's books, and I thought, oh, I exist. I really felt that kind of, and the same way, we are different. We use different vocabularies, but just like we had the same fantasy. Mm-hmm. I remember I said, I wish I'd known you in graduate school. I wish we'd gone to graduate school together. I wish I'd known you here. I'd known you here. Yeah. We could have figured out those experiences together.
Totally.
And I feel that bittersweet, almost sense of regret, or that remembering that loneliness, not having you. Yeah. And I love that I can say this to you. Yeah. And it doesn't sound weird.
Yeah. I know.
So,
yeah.
But I also love what you said, living into your fear. Mm-hmm. And I thought, well, that's something I love about you. Or maybe that's just the name of something that I already loved about you. But that's what you're doing. And that's what you're doing in this book, is that you are writing into the fear with such grace, blazing, honest grace, the way you look at things with open eyes, unflinchingly, lightly, and seriously at the same time in some way. And so I know people want to ask questions perhaps, or if not, everybody, I'm going to bring us to a point in the book when Julietta writes about, I got these Invisalign.
I feel like I'm heading in that direction. I'll be right behind you on the Invisalign.
Can I ask you, on the bottom of 71, I've almost memorized it.
Okay.
Maybe you can recall off the top of your head.
You know it better than I do.
Perhaps at this point. How quickly the world can turn on itself. So these paragraphs, I want to know when you wrote them, because to me, they capture the right now. But you're writing about your father, and you're writing about partition.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to know about writing these sentences, because they capture with such fluidity, such eerie beauty, exactly where we are now in the world. Would you read
you want
that paragraph? Please.
Yeah, sure. So this is me writing about my father's history and the history of partition. How quickly the world can turn on itself. How impossible to believe that where yesterday was love, today is a slashing of limbs, the mass rape of girls and women. Hundreds of thousands of people packed up overnight and left homes they had lived in for generations. Many were slaughtered in transit by an uncontrolled swell of misdirected emotion, a blind and terrified rush, a colonized force that realized in full its oppression through unmitigated murder, uninhibited rape and abduction, and unconstrained pillaging, a teeming colonized body slaughtering itself into an independent future as its rulers gathered up their stolen wealth and headed home.
What you execute here, I mean, the responsibility of trying to articulate this experience, you do it in these sentences. I'm just curious, from a craft point of view, this is a lot of work. Can you talk to us about what that responsibility was for you to reproduce this moment?
Yeah, I'm always, I was thinking about you were talking to me about this yesterday when you were saying, I feel like it speaks to so many moments, to so many places. It's a specific, it's a little bit like the you in the breaks, which is like a singular you, and also a very capacious, unnameable, uncountable mass you. And I think that the writing of the partition is so specific to partition, but also, as you're saying, like speaks to so many different histories and so many different sets of world relations over time. And I think, for me, I feel an incredible responsibility. I don't want to call it a burden because I don't have to shoulder it, but I think it's an incredible responsibility because it's one of those moments. I don't know if you can relate to this, but where it's so much my history, it's mine, but I also didn't live through it in that palpable, immediate way. And so when you emerge from histories of profound trauma, and your parents and your grandparents and your ancestors experienced extraordinary trauma that is almost unimaginable to you because you haven't lived through it in that palpable, immediate way. I always feel very careful. I think this is where the kind of burden of representation, like when you're representing something that's both yours and not yours, that's so profoundly, intimately you, but is also, the experience of my father, not me. I feel like I have to take great care, and I feel, the tension of, I don't worry so much about getting it wrong, but I do want to represent it in a way that speaks, that speaks to some kind of truth. I don't know if that totally answers your question, but I think the that kind of balance between political history and filial history that comprises you. And the difference between, I've written about the partition of India in academic contexts with much less, with much less poetry and much less imagination. Just wrote historical in 1947. And so this is a different kind of responsibility, and this is a different kind of. I think when you're putting poetic language to historical moments that are sutured to you, but that you didn't live through. It's a kind of writing for me that is as important as another question that you were asking me about earlier, which is the question of like, how do you write about other people? I think it requires that kind of detail and that kind of care and that kind of attention.
Juliette, I have one more question for you before we unfortunately have to end. What is our responsibility as writers of color, as Black and brown women, intellectuals, as teachers? Do you think about this? What do you feel about tonight?
Emily, you're just hammering me over the head here with like the biggest, the biggest one of all. I think the question of responsibility is I think a question that's very difficult to answer for a collective. And I think in the wake of the pandemic, we're asking that question from different directions that were always the questions we should have been asking, but we're having to ask more immediately now in terms of what our responsibilities are to other people, et cetera. But those questions are just amplified by the pandemic. They're the questions that we always should have been asking. I think I don't know what my responsibility is, but I know what my work is. I think maybe that's another way of putting it. And I think I think I'm learning my responsibility, almost on the daily. And I think I have a responsibility to you. I know I have a responsibility to my child. I have a responsibility to maybe mostly I have a responsibility to rethinking what it means to be in community. And I think for me, the most urgent and pressing question of my life now is like, who is the we that we're working for and with? And I think I'm always kind of haunted and enlivened by that question of the we. And so I think if I have a responsibility or if I have work, the work is toward a much broader, much more capacious, and much more intimate form of a becoming we, to really like work to understand who we're leaving out, who gets left out when we're making claims to a kind of us. I think for me, that's the work.
I like that a lot. Well, after reading your book, I feel a deepening of my responsibility. And I do also feel a responsibility to you. And I think that
we've decided that we're in it for the long haul.
We're in it. We're in it. And I'm going to tell the truth because you told the truth. And I think every reader who encounters your book is going to be enlivened by your truth telling and feel a deeper sense of a joyful need to understand what their own role is in healing the insanity around us. So, and I mean, it really is a joyful experience, the encounter with your words and with your mind. So I want to ask ER to come back in the room and to get us to the next stage of this evening. Thank you so much.
Emily, thank you. I'm overjoyed to be in dialogue with you and in life now, moving forward after tonight. Thank you so much. Hi, ER. Welcome back.
Hi. Thank y'all both so much. This was so beautiful and lovely, and I think hope giving to a lot of people, certainly to me. So those are my favorite kinds of events. So thank you. I want to encourage folks. I dropped a link to Black is the Body in the chat, but they are also links to all of Emily's books a little bit higher up. You can click this teal button at the bottom center of your screen to buy the breaks, but it also will take you to all of Julietta's books. So if you are just learning about Julietta for the first time tonight, and now your mind is blown and you are like ready for the deep dive, go deep dive, buy all three, and get going, because I think certainly all three of your books, you know, offer this depth and this connectivity, this tissue and this hope and all these things that have come out tonight. So thank you both so much for being here. Thank you to everyone in the chat for being with us. I will be adding captions to this video and putting it up on our YouTube channel, which is just YouTube.com/Charis Circle. So be on the lookout for that. And in general, we love for folks to check out our upcoming events at charisbooksandmore.com. We have a wonderful September full of exciting folks. So please join us for those events. Please stay safe and well. And again, congratulations, Julietta. We're really so glad this book is in the world.
Thank you, and thank you to everybody who was here, even though I can't see any of you, but I'm feeling you.
Thanks everybody for coming. Thank you too.
Bye.
Thank
Okay,
you.
see you again.
Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.